the struggle for, um, a better climate. So Phoebe, I don't know if you want to move me to the first slide. All right. I first just wanted to talk about like how it is very true that every vote can literally matter. Um, so the example on the left is a Portland City Council election from 2021. It was tied. So that meant that both of the two candidates got the exact same number of votes. And so like if one additional person had voted for either candidate, that would have potentially changed, how it would have gone down. And so how they actually decided who won was they brought a bowl out from Portland City Hall and pulled a name from it. And that's who decided who is our city councilor. So, like, I think this is a really good example because it just shows that, like your vote can actually have, like, your individual vote can have a pretty significant impact on, who gets elected. Um, and that's definitely something that is a lot more likely to happen, with these sort of smaller scale local elections. But statewide elections can often be closer than we might suspect them to be, which I think the 2016 election in Maine is a pretty good example. It was only decided by a 3% margin, which is like a very small number of people, only 22,000 people decided how Maine's electoral votes were allocated. Um, so like it's just like very important that you're voting because of the fact that you never know what's going to happen on election day, and votes can be decided by pretty slim margins. Phoebe, if you want to go to the next slide. But I also think it's just important to talk about this like pretty concretely as well. You kind of often hear that voting is important, or it's important to express yourself, et cetera, which is all true. But it's also important to actually think about it in like, what does it actually mean? Which is fundamentally that in a democratic system like ours, elections determine, who has power in government. So who decides what happens in our country. And basically just, elected officials are the ones who set policy, decide legislation, and really kind of impact our lives and our future. And furthermore, as organizers or like organizers, for climate change or, whatever issue you're working on, elections also really determine the kind of organizing terrain and determine what priorities we're able to work on and what we're able to win. And like perhaps you might not necessarily like either candidate or anything like that, but it is certainly the case that whoever wins the election really has an impact on, what you're able to accomplish like legislatively. And elections also really generate narratives and like discourse about what the public wants to happen, which can really impact what legislation gets passed or how politicians are going to operate. And they, fundamentally, the interest of a politician is to get reelected. And so elections and like how close they are, or how the demographics of an election play out, like all of that creates incentives for politicians to act in a certain way, so that they can get reelected in the future. So basically, all of that is to say, is that like expressing yourself and like voting, like that's all important, but really why elections matter is because they kind of impact policy and like how we're able to change things in our society. Next slide. And I think it goes without saying that this is an incredibly important election. You've probably heard, a bunch of times that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. which, I think there's certainly a case to be made for that. It's going to impact a lot of issues that you probably care about and that, affect your life. So everything from abortion to immigration, healthcare, etc. But I also think specifically talking about it from a climate perspective, like this is a pretty important moment. There's been some progress, but we're still slated for 3 degrees warming. Um, and so, this election and at all levels, so federal, state, local, is going to impact like to what extent we're able to lower that. Um, so I guess like kind of running through some of these specific elections that are going to be on the ballot in Maine. Next slide. So I'm sure that you've all probably heard about the presidential election. That is in 3 weeks on November 5th. It's between Trump and Kamala Harris, and the president is obviously incredibly powerful, incredibly important, and arguably the most powerful person on the planet. But I think it's good to talk about specifically what they're able to do, um, which is they can appoint judges. The Supreme Court has been in the news a lot lately. Because of its recent decisions. I think a good example to bring up is it recently overturned this thing called Chevron doctrine, which isn't really important to like get into specifically, but basically it's had a pretty big impact on what the Environmental Protection Agency is able to do. So like through that, the president has a big impact on what happens. The president can also issue executive orders and appoints the cabinet, which determines a lot of administrative law. So things like the EPA. The president also sets the legislative agenda and can veto legislation, so has a big impact on what legislation can get passed. They also set the federal budget, which is pretty important. How money is spent. I think a good thing to note about this election is that the 2017 tax cuts expire next year. So in a lot of ways, sort of behind the scenes, this election is really about like if like those tax cuts are going to be ended or like continued. And also, the president has a lot of power over foreign and military policy, which, war is bad and causes a lot of, emissions and agreements with other governments about climate is like another thing as well. So all of that is to say is that the presidential election is like incredibly important, which I think probably everyone knows. But I think it's just, good to kind of lay out like specifically why. Also, Maine is a very interesting state, which is because of the fact that we do this sort of unique thing where we split our electoral votes by congressional district, which you might have heard about. But essentially, we have the first congressional district, which gets one electoral vote, the second congressional district, which gets another, and then whoever wins the whole state gets two. Which makes it sort of interesting because if you're in the first district, it's almost certainly going to go towards Harris. But if the second district, it's a little harder to say what's going to happen. So if you're living in the second district, which I'll kind of explain in a second, it's especially important that you're voting because it's going to be close. Another pretty interesting thing that Maine does for the first time ever this year is we're going to have ranked choice voting for the president, which essentially means that you get to rank someone first, then someone second, and someone third, and so on, rather than just voting for a single candidate. Which, if you've voted before, we do that for our congressional people. And also like certain municipalities. But this will be the first time we're doing it for the president. So that means like perhaps if you aren't, especially inclined to vote for either of the two major nominees, like you can rank someone else first or second or third, and then one of them. So I think that's a really great like part about living in Maine is like we have a lot more options as well. If if you don't really want to vote for either of those two candidates, but if you want to vote for either of them, you can just rank them one, and that's also a perfectly valid way to go about doing it as well. Next slide, Phoebe. We also have a bunch of congressional elections this year. Um, Two of them are pretty like certain to go one way, so I don't think they're worth like spending a ton of time about. But basically, Angus King, who is our independent senator, is up for re-election. He's almost certainly going to win. And then Shelley Pingree, who is the Democrat representative for the first congressional district, is also up for re-election. Likewise, she is almost certainly going to win. But the interesting one, again, is the second congressional district. Jared Golden, who's currently the incumbent, is seeking re-election, and he's being challenged by a Republican, Austin Terrio. And if you want to jump to the next slide, basically, the first district is kind of southern Maine, sort of greater Portland, mid-coast. And the second district is northern, central, down east area. And so basically it's very close. You can see on the right that it's just a couple thousand votes deciding these. So if you're living in the second district, like how you vote is likely to have a pretty major impact to decide who gets elected. And I think a really great like thing to point to when you're thinking about what you want to see happen out of federal politics, especially as it relates to climate, is this bill that got passed called the the Inflation Reduction Act, which was one of the big bills passed in this recent term, which basically is going to like have an impact on how much emissions we put out. And it's not perfect or anything. But one of the things that this election, at least federally, is going to decide is, if that money continues to be available to go towards reducing emissions. And that could get undone if a party hostile to the bill is elected. So if you're thinking about climate, I think that's, a good reason to think about voting in some of these federal elections. But federal elections will kind of like take up all the spotlight. They're not the only thing on the ballot. If you want to go to the next slide. We also have state elections. And I kind of work on these mostly, so I think about them all the time. But we have elections for the state legislature that are up. And these really, really impact your life. From everything from climate stuff like offshore wind or solar energy, but also like housing and transit and abortion and like all of those things are really often decided at the state level, especially when there's a lot of gridlock federally or stuff like that. So, and I think another good thing to note is that while Maine tends like the Democrats tend to control the legislature, I think this year it's going to be very close. It's really unclear which party is going to control either chamber. So that's like a great reason to be voting. And these seats are very small. The House seats, there's 151 of them, and they have only about 9,000 people each. The Senate, there's 35 seats, and there are about 39,000 people per district. So that means like you're one of only 9,000 people who's going to determine an election. And since not everyone votes, it's actually like much lower. A lot of times it's like 6,000 people voting. So yeah. Next slide. And just to emphasize like how close these are, in 2022, there were 5 seats which were decided by less than 100 votes. The lowest of those was just by a margin of only like 23 votes. So, and in the Senate, like 8 of them were decided by under a 10% margin. with the lowest was only decided by like 146 people. So, and that's like we're talking, which party controls um, the House and the Senate in either of those cases. Like when we're talking about some of these really low margin seats. So if you are inclined to, want one party or the other to control the legislature, like it's incredibly important that like you're voting in these elections, but also that like, you're talking to your friends and neighbors to get them to vote. Because that can really like swing an election depending on what district you're in. Just like, some of these are very thin margins. And because of the fact that they're so small, just a couple, 100 more people voting can really change what happens, which can decide the future of the state. Next slide. There are also some ballot questions this year, which I think are always good to talk about. I'll just kind of briefly mention them. None of them really have like huge climate implications, but they're good to know about, and some people really care about them. So there's question one, which is about limiting money in politics. Question two and three, I don't know a ton about, but basically, they're like bond for like research and restoration of buildings. And then question four, which I think is probably the most like climate related or like climate adjacent, is about issuing bonds for trails to build more trails. And then, of course, there's question five, which is to decide if we want to change the flag back to our like original flag or not. Yeah, so like not a ton there, like specifically with climate, but like certainly important issues, which are like worth voting on. Next slide. Also, a lot of places in Maine have local elections. I can't list all of them because there's too many towns in Maine to go through all of them, but certainly it's pretty likely that in your town or city, there's probably a local election. And, sort of even a step further below the state elections, they're talked about even less. And but they're like incredibly important. They can affect issues like especially things like transit. So if you want more public transit, local elections really affect that, or things like housing, all of which can have climate implications. I think a great example is a couple of years ago in Portland, we had a municipal ballot question for what was like a local Green New Deal, which like affected like the regulations around housing as they related to like emissions. So I definitely encourage you to look into like your town and see like what elections are happening, what candidates are running. Towns will often have ballot questions. So those are like great things to be paying attention to. And next slide. I also think it's worth mentioning that Maine is the oldest state in the country, as you might be aware. And it is certainly the case that young voters tend to have a pretty different set on average of priorities and values than older voters. But what that means is that since there are fewer of us proportionally here in Maine compared to elsewhere, it's like so much more important that you as a young person are voting to make sure that like what you care about is included in the electorate. Because like if you don't vote, there's like no reason to like care about what you think. So young people need to vote to make sure that our values are prioritized by politicians when they're making decisions, whether that's locally in the state house or federally. So that is my presentation. I hope that was helpful. Phoebe, I think just the next slide is asking if people have any questions. So yeah, I can answer any questions now. Yeah.